Have you ever imagined being helplessly tied to something, unable to escape, while danger approaches you relentlessly? The terror of knowing death is coming, but being completely powerless to save yourself. This is exactly the nightmare that one innocent soul experienced in the dense forests of Northern California. Prepare yourself for a deeply moving story of abandonment, courage, and the unbreakable bond that can form between two beings in the most desperate of circumstances. The summer of 2023 brought one of the most devastating wildfire seasons in California's history. With temperatures soaring above 100 degrees for weeks on end, the once lush forests of Shasta County had transformed into a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Local fire departments were stretched thin, working around the clock to protect communities, while wildlife fled from the approaching infernos that devoured everything in their path. Among the brave men and women fighting these blazes was Jake Mercer, a 34-year-old firefighter with the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. Jake wasn't supposed to be working that fateful Thursday. He had requested the day off to celebrate his daughter's birthday. But when the call came in about a new fire that had erupted in the eastern part of the county, Jake couldn't ignore his duty to serve. Jake had seen many horrors during his 12 years of service. Homes reduced to ash, wildlife caught in the flames, and occasionally the remains of those who couldn't escape in time. Each loss weighed heavily on his soul, but he had learned to compartmentalize these experiences, focusing instead on those he could save. Little did he know that this day would test not only his physical courage, but the very depths of his compassion. Meanwhile, just 3 miles from where the new fire had started, a 3-year-old German Shepherd mix named Apollo lay panting in the summer heat. His chocolate-brown coat was matted with dirt, his once bright eyes now dull with confusion and fear. A thick rope bound him tightly to the trunk of an ancient oak tree, the rough fibers cutting into his neck whenever he strained against it, which he had done countless times since being abandoned there 2 days earlier. Apollo had once known love. For the first 2 years of his life, he had been the beloved companion of the Davis family in Redding, California. He had slept at the foot of young Tommy Davis's bed, chased tennis balls in the backyard, and greeted everyone who entered the home with enthusiastic affection. Apollo's world was safe, predictable, and filled with the warmth of human connection. But everything changed when Mr. Davis lost his job. Financial strain led to arguments, which led to moving to a smaller apartment, which led to the heartbreaking decision that Apollo would have to go. Unable to find a shelter with space or a friend willing to take in the energetic dog, Mr. Davis had made a choice that would haunt him forever. He drove Apollo deep into the forest, tied him securely to a tree, and walked away despite the dog's confused whimpers. Apollo didn't understand why his family had left him alone in this unfamiliar place. For hours he had barked desperately, certain that at any moment they would return to untie him and take him home. As day turned to night and then back to day again, his barks had grown hoarser, his hope dimming with each passing hour. By the 3rd day, Apollo had settled into a resigned silence, conserving his energy, his thirst becoming an all-consuming torment. He might have died there, slowly and painfully, if not for what happened next. As the afternoon sun beat down through the canopy of leaves above him, Apollo's sensitive nose detected something alarming: smoke. At first, it was just a faint scent carried on the breeze, but soon it grew stronger, more acrid. His instincts screamed danger, triggering a primal panic that sent surges of adrenaline through his dehydrated body. Miles away, Jake and his crew were gearing up, loading their trucks with equipment and water. Reports indicated that the fire was spreading quickly, fueled by dry underbrush and pushed by steady winds from the east. Air support had been requested, but the closest available planes were already engaged with another blaze. This fire would have to be fought on the ground, at least for the crucial first hours of containment efforts. As Jake pulled on his protective gear, he thought briefly of his daughter Emma's disappointed face when he had called to say he wouldn't make it to her party. 8 years old today, she had wanted nothing more than for her daddy to be there when she blew out her candles. "I'll make it up to you, Princess," he had promised, knowing that in their family, such promises were all too familiar. By the time the firefighting team reached the perimeter of the blaze, the situation was already deteriorating rapidly. What had started as a manageable brush fire had grown into a roaring inferno, with flames leaping from tree to treetop. The fire had created its own weather system, with strong updrafts feeding oxygen to the flames and carrying burning debris that ignited new spot fires ahead of the main front. Jake's captain divided the team into smaller units, each assigned to different sectors of the fire line. Jake and his partner Miguel were sent to establish a firebreak along the eastern flank, where the forest met a small stream. If they could stop the fire's advance there, they might be able to prevent it from jumping to the denser woods beyond, where it would become virtually unstoppable. Through the thick smoke and oppressive heat, the two men worked methodically, clearing brush and wetting down the area with their limited water supply. The roar of the approaching fire was like a freight train, drowning out all other sounds except for the occasional crack of a falling tree or the urgent squawks of their radios. Neither man spoke much. They were conserving their breath, their lungs already burning from the toxic air that seeped through their masks. As they worked their way along the stream bed, Jake's instincts told him they were losing the battle. The fire was moving too fast, consuming everything in its path with indiscriminate hunger. Soon, they would have to retreat to safer ground or risk being trapped. He was about to signal to Miguel that they should turn back when a sound reached his ears. Faint but distinct, even through the chaos of the wildfire. It was a sound that didn't belong in this hellscape of heat and destruction. The desperate cry of a dog. Jake froze, his body tensing as he strained to hear the sound again through the crackling roar of the approaching flames. There it was, unmistakable even amid the chaos, a dog's panicked bark, high-pitched and frantic with terror. He turned to Miguel, who was still focused on clearing brush, unaware of the distant cries for help that had captured Jake's attention. "There's a dog out there!" Jake shouted, his voice muffled by his mask, but urgent enough that Miguel stopped working immediately. When Miguel looked at him with confusion, Jake pointed in the direction of the sound. "Can't you hear it? Something's trapped in there." There, he was pointing to, was a section of forest already being swallowed by thick black smoke, with flames visible through the trees. Miguel grabbed Jake's arm, his grip tight with concern. "The fire's moving too fast in that direction. Command already ordered us to finish this section and fall back." His eyes, visible through his mask's visor, were wide with alarm at what he could see Jake was considering. The wind shifted suddenly, bringing a wave of intense heat that forced both men to step back, a grim reminder of how quickly their situation could turn deadly. Jake's radio crackled to life with their captain's voice, confirming what Miguel had just said. "All units on the eastern flank, abandon your position and retreat to Safety Point Delta. I repeat, retreat immediately. The fire has jumped the containment line." The urgency in the captain's tone left no room for debate. They were in imminent danger, and every second counted in their escape. But as Jake turned to follow the evacuation order, the dog's cries became more desperate, more pleading, a sound that Jake, as a lifelong animal lover, found impossible to ignore. This wasn't the howl of a wild animal fleeing the fire. This was the cry of a domestic dog, one that sounded trapped and terrified. In that moment, Jake made a decision that went against everything in his training. "I can't leave it," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "That's someone's pet out there." Before Miguel could stop him, Jake was already moving toward the sound, angling around the worst of the visible flames but still heading directly into danger. Miguel called after him, but Jake's mind was set. He'd never been able to ignore an animal in distress, not since he was a child bringing home injured birds and stray cats. Miguel swore under his breath, torn between following protocol and supporting his partner. With a quick update to command about Jake's detour, he reluctantly followed, knowing that Jake would have a better chance of survival with backup. The smoke grew thicker as they pushed forward, forcing them to crouch lower and navigate by sound more than sight. The heat was becoming unbearable, even through their protective gear. Jake could feel sweat pouring down his face inside his mask, and his throat burned with each breath despite the filtered air. But the dog's barking was growing louder, spurring him forward even as fallen debris and burning underbrush made their path increasingly treacherous. They found Apollo in a small clearing, tied so tightly to a massive oak tree that he couldn't move more than a few feet in any direction. The dog's panic was evident in his wild eyes and thrashing body, his paws bloodied from trying to dig himself free, his coat singed in places where embers had already landed on him. When he saw the two men approaching, his barking changed from desperate to hopeful. Jake rushed to the tree, shocked at the deliberate cruelty of the situation. Someone had tied this dog here intentionally, with a rope so thick and not so complex that it would be impossible for the animal to break free. "Who would do this?" he muttered, pulling out his utility knife to cut through the rope. The dog whimpered and pressed against him, as if understanding that these strangers represented his only chance at survival. As Jake worked on the rope, Miguel kept watch, his attention split between the approaching fire and their increasingly urgent radio. "Command wants our position," he shouted over the roaring flames that were now visible on 3 sides of the clearing. "They're saying this whole section is about to be lost." Even as he relayed this information, a massive pine tree crashed to the ground not 50 yards away, sending up a shower of sparks that rained down around them. Apollo's rope finally gave way under Jake's knife, but the dog didn't bolt as expected. Instead, he stood shakily on his legs, disoriented and weak from dehydration and smoke inhalation. Jake realized with a sinking feeling that the animal was too debilitated to run out on his own power. They would have to carry him. And carrying a 70-pound German shepherd through a burning forest would slow their escape considerably. Miguel saw the hesitation on Jake's face and understood the new complication. Without a word, he helped Jake hoist the large dog, draping Apollo's limp body across Jake's shoulders in a firefighter's carry. The added weight immediately made Jake's movements more laborious, but there was no question of leaving the dog behind now that they had come this far. Their retreat was a nightmare of smoke, heat, and disorientation. Twice they had to change direction as walls of flame cut off their planned escape route. Their oxygen supplies were running low, their radio communications becoming spotty as the fire interfered with the signal. Miguel led the way, using his axe to clear fallen branches while constantly checking behind to ensure Jake and his canine burden were keeping pace. The forest that had seemed navigable on their way in had transformed into a maze of fire and falling timber on their way out. Jake's legs burned with exertion, and his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. Apollo had gone completely still on his shoulders, a worrying sign that the dog might be succumbing to smoke inhalation. If they didn't reach fresh air soon, neither of them would make it. Just when Jake thought his strength would fail him completely, they stumbled upon a shallow creek bed, its trickle of summer water creating a narrow path where the vegetation was thinner and slightly more resistant to the flames. Miguel pointed downstream, shouting something that Jake couldn't hear over the fire's roar, but the meaning was clear. This was their best chance at navigating out of the inferno. They sloshed through ankle-deep water, the relatively cooler air near the creek bed, providing momentary relief for their scorched lungs. Jake shifted Apollo's weight, alarmed at how still the dog remained. Only the shallow rise and fall of the animal's ribcage assured Jake that their rescue mission wasn't already a tragic failure. "Stay with me, buddy," he muttered, though he doubted Apollo could hear him. Above them, the fire had formed a near-continuous canopy, with flames leaping from tree to treetop in a terrifying display of nature's raw power. The radiant heat was so intense that Jake could feel it burning through his protective gear, a sensation akin to standing too close to an open furnace. His training had prepared him for fire's danger, but had never fully conveyed its malevolent sentience, the way it seemed to hunt them, probing for weaknesses in their defenses. Miguel suddenly stopped, raising his hand in warning. Ahead, a massive burning tree had fallen directly across their escape route. blocking the creek bed with a barrier of flames. The detour they would need to take would lead them back into the densest part of the forest, where the fire's intensity would be at its peak. The looks they exchanged contained a grim acknowledgement. They were running out of options. It was in this moment of despair that Jake felt Apollo stir on his shoulders, the dog's body tensing as if gathering what little strength remained. When Jake set him down to reassess their options, Apollo didn't collapse as expected. Instead, he stood on shaky legs, his nose lifted high, testing the air with an instinct that transcended his weakened state. Then, to both firefighters' astonishment, Apollo began limping purposefully away from the fallen tree, not back toward the burning forest, but along a nearly invisible game trail that veered from the creek bed. "He knows something we don't," Jake said, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. Throughout history, there had been countless stories of animals sensing danger and finding escape routes that humans overlooked. Why not trust this one? Miguel hesitated only briefly before nodding his agreement. Their training and equipment had taken them as far as they could go. Perhaps it was time to trust in something more primal. Following Apollo required faith that bordered on madness. The trail led them through smoke so thick they could barely see each other, much less the dog limping a few feet ahead. Yet Apollo moved with growing confidence, his survival instinct overriding his injuries and exhaustion. When he paused, they paused. When he changed direction to avoid a hotspot they couldn't yet see, they followed without question. The game trail eventually widened, revealing itself as an old logging path overgrown with decades of new growth. The relative sparseness of large trees made this corridor less vulnerable to the crown fire raging through the forest canopy. For the first time since they'd found Apollo, Jake allowed himself to believe they might actually survive this ordeal. His radio crackled with renewed clarity. They were approaching the fire's edge. When they finally broke through to a staging area where other firefighters and emergency vehicles had gathered, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Medical teams rushed to their aid. Oxygen masks were thrust over their faces, and Apollo was quickly wrapped in wet towels to cool his burned paws and singed coat. The dog's eyes never left Jake, even as veterinary technicians swarmed around him, starting IV fluids for his dehydration. Captain Ramirez stormed over, his face a mask of fury and relief. "What the hell were you thinking, Mercer?" he demanded, though the question seemed rhetorical. "You disobeyed a direct order and nearly got yourself and Sanchez killed." But even as he delivered his reprimand, his eyes drifted to Apollo, who was now receiving oxygen through a special canine mask, his tail offering a weak thump of acknowledgement. The transformation in the captain's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Like most firefighters, he had a soft spot for animals, especially ones that had endured such obvious cruelty. "Is that why you went off protocol for a dog?" The question contained less anger now, more genuine curiosity. When Jake nodded, still too oxygen-deprived to speak properly, the captain shook his head in a gesture that somehow conveyed both exasperation and understanding. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical evaluations, debriefings, and paperwork. Jake and Miguel were treated for smoke inhalation and minor burns, but their protective gear had spared them from more serious injuries. Apollo's condition was more concerning. In addition to smoke inhalation and dehydration, he had second-degree burns on his paws and legs, and the rope had left a raw wound around his neck that would require careful treatment to prevent infection. As evening fell, Jake found himself sitting beside Apollo's treatment area in the emergency veterinary tent that had been set up at the fire command post. The German Shepherd was sedated but stable, his breathing easier now after hours of oxygen therapy. A young vet tech had just finished changing the bandages on Apollo's paws when she noticed Jake watching. "Are you the one who found him?" she asked, her voice soft with compassion. Jake nodded, his throat still raw from the smoke, but his voice returning. He was tied to a tree, he explained, anger flaring anew at the memory. Someone left him there to die. The words hung in the air between them, a testament to humanity's capacity for both cruelty and kindness. Jake reached out to gently stroke Apollo's head, careful to avoid the areas where his fur had been singed away. The tech checked Apollo's IV before responding. "Well, he's got a fighting chance now, thanks to you. We've contacted animal control, and they'll take him to a shelter once he's stable enough for transport." She hesitated, then added, "Unless you know someone who might want to adopt him?" The question was casual, but Jake caught the underlying suggestion. A life saved often created a bond not easily broken. As Jake sat there, watching Apollo's chest rise and fall in the rhythm of healing sleep, something shifted inside him. He thought about his daughter Emma, whose birthday he had missed for what seemed like the 100th time. He thought about the promises he made and broke because of his demanding job, the way his family had learned to celebrate without him, to lower their expectations of his presence. And then he thought about the way Apollo had led them to safety when all human knowledge had failed. The call to his wife Sarah that night was one of the hardest Jake had ever made. He began with an apology for missing Emma's birthday, which Sarah accepted with the weary grace of someone who had heard it many times before. But when he started to explain about Apollo, something in his voice must have conveyed the magnitude of what had happened, because she fell silent, listening without interruption as the whole story poured out of him. "I want to bring him home," Jake finally said, the words surprising him almost as much as they surprised her. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and he braced himself for the reasonable objections. Their small yard, their busy schedules, the additional expense of a large dog with medical needs. Instead, Sarah asked a single question. "Does he need us as much as you think we need him?" That night, Jake slept in a cot near Apollo's recovery area, unwilling to leave the dog who had saved his life. In the quiet hours, as the command post hummed with the subdued activity of the overnight shift, he made a silent promise to the sleeping animal. This time, it was a promise he intended to keep, not just to Apollo, but to himself. A promise to recognize what truly mattered, to be present for the important moments, to never again take for granted the gift of life they had been given. The next morning brought both challenges and unexpected support. Captain Ramirez, after reviewing the incident report and hearing from Miguel about Apollo's crucial role in their escape, quietly dropped the formal reprimand he had been preparing. "Just don't make a habit of playing hero," he warned Jake, though his gruff tone couldn't quite hide his approval. "And tell that mutt of yours he's got a standing invitation to visit the station." When the veterinarian arrived to check on Apollo, she was accompanied by a police officer who took Jake's statement about finding Apollo tied to the tree. "We take animal abandonment very seriously," the officer explained, "especially in circumstances like these." He photographed Apollo's injuries and the remnants of the rope Jake had cut away. "If we can identify who did this, they'll face felony charges." Apollo's recovery progressed with remarkable speed. By the third day, he was able to stand and walk short distances despite his bandaged paws. His personality emerged as the sedatives were reduced. A gentle, intelligent demeanor, punctuated by moments of playful energy that hinted at the spirited dog he had been before his abandonment. Most striking was his attachment to Jake. Apollo would follow his rescuer with his eyes even when too weak to physically follow him. The investigation into Apollo's abandonment yielded results faster than anyone expected. The distinctive rope and the location where Apollo had been found led authorities to a gas station security footage showing Mr. Davis's car on the Forest Access Road. Confronted with the evidence and the public outrage that had swelled as Apollo's story spread through local news, Davis broke down and confessed, expressing remorse that seemed genuine but came too late. A week after the rescue, Jake was finally able to bring Apollo home. The dog's medical care would continue for weeks, with regular visits to a local veterinarian who had offered discounted services after hearing about the case. Sarah and Emma had spent the intervening days preparing for their new family member, reading about German shepherds and trauma in dogs, setting up a comfortable bed in a quiet corner of their living room. Emma's reaction to Apollo exceeded even Jake's hopeful expectations. The 8-year-old, initially cautious around the bandaged dog, quickly formed a bond that seemed almost magical in its immediacy. She read books aloud to him as he rested, carefully helped change his water bowl, and solemnly informed visitors that Apollo was a hero dog who had saved her daddy from the fire. In her eyes, the missed birthday had transformed from disappointment to the day their family became complete. Apollo's adjustment to home life had its difficult moments. The first thunderstorm after his arrival sent him into a panic, the booming sounds and flashes of lightning too reminiscent of the forest fire. He wedged himself into the smallest space he could find, under Emma's bed, and refused to come out until the storm passed. It was Emma who crawled in beside him, not to coax him out, but simply to keep him company in his fear. Physical healing came more quickly than emotional recovery. The burns on Apollo's paws healed cleanly, leaving only slight scarring that would fade with time. The wound around his neck, where the rope had cut into his flesh, required more intensive care and would always leave a visible mark, a permanent reminder of what he had endured. Yet even as his body mended, nightmares would wake him whimpering and shaking, reliving the terror of being abandoned or trapped in flames. Jake found himself uniquely equipped to understand Apollo's trauma. His own experiences fighting fires had left their mark. Flashbacks, moments of irrational fear, nights when sleep wouldn't come because the smell of smoke seemed to linger in his nostrils. In comforting Apollo, Jake discovered a new language for his own healing, a way to acknowledge and move through fear rather than suppress it behind a facade of stoicism. The first major milestone in Apollo's recovery came on a crisp autumn day, 3 months after the fire. Jake had taken him to a secluded field, away from traffic and crowds, to let him run without the constraints of a leash. Initially hesitant, Apollo stayed close to Jake's side, as if afraid that too much distance might result in another abandonment. But then a rabbit darted across the field, and something primordial awakened in Apollo, the simple joy of the chase. Watching Apollo run at full speed, his powerful legs stretching out in graceful bounds, Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was what healing looked like, not a return to some imagined state of perfection, but the gradual reclaiming of joy, confidence, and trust. Apollo didn't catch the rabbit, of course, but when he returned to Jake, his tongue lolling in a doggy grin, his eyes were bright with an unmistakable message. "I'm still here. I survived, and I can be happy again." As winter settled over Northern California, bringing much-needed rain to the fire-scarred landscape, Apollo found his place in the rhythms of the Mercer family's life. He walked Emma to the school bus each morning and was waiting when she returned. He slept at the foot of Jake and Sarah's bed, a warm, reassuring presence during the long nights. And on the days when Jake's shifts at the fire station kept him away, Apollo seemed to understand his temporary absence was not abandonment. Jake would always come home. The community that had rallied around Apollo's story continued to show their support in unexpected ways. A local pet store provided a lifetime supply of food. A professional dog trainer offered free sessions to help with Apollo's lingering anxiety. Children wrote letters and drew pictures of the hero dog, which Emma proudly displayed on the refrigerator. In a town that had seen its share of tragedy, Apollo's journey from victim to survivor to beloved family member offered a narrative of hope that resonated deeply. The most profound change, however, was in Jake himself. The experience of nearly losing his life in the forest, of being guided to safety by the very creature he had sought to save, had shifted something fundamental in his perspective. He began turning down optional overtime shifts, prioritizing family dinners and school events over the constant push to be the department's most reliable responder. When he did work, he brought a new awareness to the job, a heightened respect for fire's destructive power and a deeper appreciation for the fragility and preciousness of each life he was sworn to protect. 1 year after the fire, on Emma's 9th birthday, the Mercer family held a dual celebration. As Emma blew out her candles, surrounded by friends and family, Apollo sat faithfully at her side, his coat now glossy and full, the only visible reminder of his ordeal being the band of lighter fur around his neck, where the rope had once been. Jake stood watching, his arm around Sarah, marveling at how completely Apollo had transformed from the desperate creature he'd found in the burning forest into this confident, loving companion. "We're also celebrating Apollo's rescue day," Jake explained to the gathered guests, many of whom already knew the story, but listened raptly nonetheless. "1 year ago, this brave dog saved my life and Miguel's by leading us out of a wildfire that should have killed all 3 of us." As if understanding he was being discussed, Apollo's ears perked up, his intelligent eyes moving from Jake to the captivated faces around him. The story had spread far beyond their small community in the months following Apollo's rescue. A local journalist had written an article that was picked up by national news outlets, bringing attention not just to Apollo's ordeal, but to the larger issues of animal abandonment and cruelty. Donations poured into local animal shelters, and there was a marked increase in adoptions of older and special needs dogs as people were inspired by Apollo's resilience and capacity for trust after trauma. Mr. Davis, who had abandoned Apollo in the forest, had faced legal consequences for his actions, a fine and community service hours at an animal shelter, but the greater punishment seemed to be the knowledge of what he had almost done. He had written a letter of apology to the Mercer family, which Jake had read once and then set aside, neither willing to forgive easily nor wishing to hold on to anger that would serve no purpose. Some wounds, Jake had learned, healed best when simply acknowledged and then allowed to rest. Apollo's presence had changed the Mercer household in countless subtle ways. The house was no longer empty during the day, with Apollo keeping Sarah company as she worked from her home office. The backyard, once a neglected square of lawn, had been transformed into a dog-friendly space with shaded areas for hot days and plenty of room to play fetch, Apollo's favorite game. Most notably, there was more laughter, more spontaneous moments of joy that punctuated even the most ordinary days. For Emma, Apollo had become more than a pet. He was confident, playmate, and protector. She had overcome her initial shyness at school by bringing Apollo to show and tell, proudly recounting his heroic escape from the fire. The story, told from a child's perspective but with unwavering conviction, had elevated her status among her peers and given her a newfound confidence that extended beyond discussions of her remarkable dog. Jake's relationship with his work had found a healthier balance. He remained dedicated to firefighting but had learned to set boundaries that protected his family time. His colleagues noted the change, a certain calm that had replaced his former intensity, a wisdom that informed his decisions during crisis situations. When newer recruits joined the department, Jake often used Apollo's story as a teaching tool about both the unpredictability of fire behavior and the unexpected sources of strength one might find in the darkest moments. The forest where Apollo had been abandoned and rescued was slowly regenerating, as forests do after fire. New growth pushed through the blackened soil. Wildlife cautiously returned to establish new territories, and the scars of devastation gradually softened under nature's patient restoration. Jake sometimes took Apollo back to the general area, though never to the exact spot of his abandonment, to witness this rebirth, a physical manifestation of the resilience they both embodied. Apollo himself seemed to understand the significance of his journey. There was a wisdom in his gaze that went beyond ordinary canine intelligence, a gentleness with smaller animals and children that suggested an empathy born from suffering. Yet he was still very much a dog, chasing squirrels with abandon, rolling happily in fresh grass, barking at the occasional delivery person with territorial enthusiasm. His capacity to fully embrace the present, despite his traumatic past, was perhaps his greatest gift to the family who had taken him in. As Jake watched Emma and her friends playing with Apollo in the yard, he reflected on the strange symmetry of life, how the worst day of Apollo's life had collided with what should have been one of the worst days of Jake's, creating instead a beginning rather than an ending. A missed birthday had led to a rescue had led to a homecoming, and a homecoming had led to a family made more whole, more compassionate, and more aware of the preciousness of each shared moment. Sometimes Jake knew it takes standing at the edge of loss to truly see what matters. Apollo had taught him that the most heroic acts aren't always the dramatic rescues that make headlines, but the daily decisions to show up, to remain faithful, to choose connection over isolation. The dog who had been abandoned and left to die had somehow found the courage to trust again, not blindly, but with eyes wide open to both the potential for pain and the possibility of joy. In this way, Apollo's story was more than just an account of one remarkable dog's survival. It was a reminder that even in our darkest hours, when the path forward seems consumed by fire and smoke, there exists the potential for rebirth and renewal. That sometimes the way out isn't found on any map or taught in any training manual, but discovered only when we have the courage to follow an unexpected guide. And that true healing comes not from forgetting our wounds, but from transforming them into bridges that connect us more deeply to ourselves and to others. So, as Emma's birthday candles sent their smoke spiraling toward the ceiling, as Apollo thumped his tail against the hardwood floor, as friends and family gathered close in celebration, Jake offered up a silent prayer of gratitude for second chances, for unexpected heroes, for the mysterious ways in which tragedy can give birth to blessing, and for the profound truth that sometimes the things that save us come from the places and beings we least expect.